The Doolittle Raid, the strike that shocked Japan, the real story. In the spring of 1942, America was still reeling from the disaster of Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Empire had swept across the Pacific, conquering the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Japan seemed unstoppable. Morale in the United States was dangerously low. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, desperate for a victory, or even a symbolic blow, asked his military commanders for a bold idea. Could Japan itself be attacked? At the time, this seemed impossible. The U.S. had no bases close enough for bombers to reach Japan and return safely. But an audacious concept emerged from Captain Francis Lowe, a Navy officer, who suggested that medium bombers could take off from an aircraft carrier, something never done before. That idea led to one of the most daring missions of the war, the Doolittle Raid. Planning the impossible. The mission would be led by Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle, a famous test pilot, aeronautical engineer, and air racing champion. Doolittle was fearless, brilliant, and willing to take risks no one else would. The plan? Launch 16 B-25B Mitchell bombers from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, strike targets on Japan's home islands, and then continue west to land in China since the planes couldn't possibly return to the carrier. It was a one-way mission. The crews would have to bail out or crash land after bombing Tokyo. The operation was kept secret even from most of the men involved until the last moment. Volunteers were called for a dangerous mission, and all 80 airmen stepped forward without hesitation. Training the raiders. The B-25 bombers were modified for the raid, extra fuel tanks, stripped-down guns, and lighter equipment to extend their range. The crews trained at Eglin Field, Florida, practicing short takeoffs on airstrips marked to simulate the tiny flight deck of a carrier, only about 500 feet long. The goal? Get fully loaded bombers airborne in less than 15 seconds. The men practiced relentlessly until they could do it perfectly. The combination of skill, courage, and trust in Doolittle's leadership made them ready for what was to come. The launch from USS Hornet. On April 2, 1942, the USS Hornet sailed from San Francisco Bay carrying the 16 B-25 bombers lashed to its flight deck. It joined with USS Enterprise and a protective task force of cruisers and destroyers, forming one of the most powerful naval groups yet assembled in the Pacific. But the mission almost ended in disaster. On the morning of April 18, 1942, the task force was spotted by a Japanese patrol boat 650 miles from Japan, far from the intended launch point. The boat was sunk, but the element of surprise was gone. Doolittle and the fleet commanders knew Japanese forces would soon be on alert. The bombers had only two options: launch early and risk running out of fuel before reaching China, or turn back and lose the chance to strike Japan. Doolittle didn't hesitate. Launch them all, he ordered. At 8:20 a.m., amid heavy seas and wind, Doolittle's B-25 rolled forward. The aircraft carrier's deck pitched up and down violently. As sailors held their breath, Doolittle's plane lifted off, barely clearing the bow, and soared into the gray Pacific sky. One by one, all 16 bombers took off successfully, a miracle of seamanship and skill. The attack on Japan. Around noon, Doolittle's group reached the coast of Japan, flying low to avoid detection. Their targets were Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka, industrial and military sites. Doolittle's own plane dropped its bombs over Tokyo, hitting an arms factory and fuel depot. Civilians and soldiers alike were stunned. Japan had believed its home islands were untouchable. Their cities were supposed to be beyond the reach of enemy aircraft. Air raid sirens wailed across Tokyo.
Fires broke out. Though the physical damage was minor compared to later bombings, the psychological impact was enormous. The Japanese people and government were shocked. For the first time, they saw that their mainland could be attacked. Emperor Hirohito and the military command realized they had underestimated America's reach and determination.
The escape to China. After their bombing runs, the raiders turned west, heading for the Chinese coast, but the early launch meant they didn't have enough fuel. One by one, the crews ran out of gas over China and the East China Sea. Most crews bailed out into darkness and stormy weather. Some landed safely in friendly Chinese territory. Others were captured or killed. One plane landed in the Soviet Union, where its crew was interned. Of the 80 men who took off, 69 survived the raid. 8 were captured by the Japanese, 3 were executed, 1 died in captivity, and 4 were eventually freed. 2 others drowned after bailing out. Despite the losses, the mission had succeeded beyond all expectation. Japanese reaction, shock, and retaliation. The Doolittle Raid enraged the Japanese military leadership. They had promised their people that Japan was invulnerable. Now, the emperor's capital had been bombed. The Japanese high command immediately launched brutal reprisals in China, searching for the downed airmen and punishing anyone who helped them. Tens of thousands of Chinese civilians were massacred in retaliation, one of the darkest consequences of the raid. But strategically, the Japanese overreacted. The attack forced them to pull back fighter units from the Pacific Islands to defend the home front, and more importantly, led them to pursue an ambitious plan to eliminate America's carrier force once and for all. That plan would lead directly to the Battle of Midway, where Japan would suffer one of its greatest defeats. The American response: renewed spirit. Back home, news of the raid electrified the United States. After months of defeats, Americans finally had a victory to celebrate. Newspapers across the country carried headlines like, "Tokyo bombed" and "First strike on Japan." Morale skyrocketed. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Americans believed the tide could turn. Doolittle himself expected to be court-martialed for losing all 16 planes, but instead he was promoted 2 ranks to brigadier general and awarded the Medal of Honor by President Roosevelt. The legacy of the Doolittle Raid. Strategically, the Doolittle Raid caused little physical destruction, but its psychological effect was profound. It shattered Japan's sense of invincibility and forced the Imperial Navy to reconsider its defensive perimeter. The Japanese realized that the U.S. could and would strike anywhere, even across the Pacific. This led them to accelerate plans to capture Midway Island, hoping to destroy the American carriers before they could threaten Japan again. Instead, that decision brought Japan to disaster. At Midway in June 1942, the U.S. Navy sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the same ones that had attacked Pearl Harbor, turning the tide of the Pacific War. Doolittle's raid had indirectly helped make that victory possible.
Remembering the raiders. In later years, the men of the Doolittle Raid became legends. Every April, they gathered for reunions, toasting each other with silver goblets engraved with their names, one turned upside down for each member who had passed away. James Doolittle went on to command major air forces in North Africa and Europe, becoming one of America's most decorated heroes. Yet he always said that the true credit belonged to his men, the 79 airmen who volunteered for an almost impossible mission. The moment Japan realized the war had just begun. For Japan, the Doolittle Raid was more than a bombing. It was a wake-up call. The Japanese High Command, confident after Pearl Harbor, suddenly understood that America had both the will and the ingenuity to strike back. The raid proved that the United States, though wounded, was not defeated. It was awakening. And that realization sent ripples of fear and respect through Tokyo's war rooms. In the words of one Japanese officer after the war, "It was the Doolittle Raid that first made us realize that we could lose the war." Epilogue. The Doolittle Raid stands as one of the most daring missions in military history, a symbol of courage, innovation, and defiance at a time when the world was shrouded in uncertainty. It showed that America's spirit could not be broken, that from the ashes of Pearl Harbor would rise a nation ready to fight back with everything it had. And on that gray April morning in 1942, as 16 bombers lifted off from a carrier into the Pacific wind, the Japanese Empire learned a truth it would never forget. America's fight was only just beginning.